Each year, military engineering units across conflict zones worldwide conduct thousands of classified tunnel detection and demolition operations involving experimental ground-penetrating radar systems, acoustic mapping technology, and subterranean warfare tactics that push the absolute boundaries of what we understand about ancient underground networks that predate modern civilization by millennia. It happens so frequently that specialized divisions within the Israeli Defense Forces Yahalom unit, the United States Army Corps of Engineers Tunnel Denial Systems Program, and NATO's Counter-Facility Targeting Cell have dedicated entire departments to investigating structural anomalies discovered during combat operations at depths where historical records suggest no human construction should exist. With annual budgets exceeding $300 million in combined international military spending. Operation Protective Edge of 2014 saw the Israeli Defense Forces deploy over 65,000 combat personnel into the Gaza Strip, where the discovery and neutralization of over 32 Hamas-constructed smuggling tunnels created conditions where elite engineering teams routinely descended into darkness beneath one of the most archaeologically significant regions on Earth. A crossroads of ancient civilizations spanning over 5,000 years of documented human habitation by Canaanites, Philistines, Egyptians, Assyrians, Persians, and Romans, creating a perfect storm where modern explosive demolition would intersect with buried structures that certain ancient texts explicitly warned should never be disturbed. For a brief period during the final weeks of July 2014, one 6-man Yahalom combat engineering team would descend into what appeared to be a standard smuggling tunnel and discover something so profoundly ancient and terrifying beneath the modern conflict that it would fundamentally alter how Israeli intelligence agencies approach archaeological findings in active combat zones, and would result in specific coordinates in northern Gaza being permanently sealed with over 40 tons of reinforced concrete, while remaining classified at a level higher than nuclear weapon storage facilities. But what exactly was the entity that had been chained in absolute darkness for over 4,000 years beneath the blood-soaked earth of Gaza? And why did an elite team of battle-hardened combat engineers simply vanish one by one into the shadows, while their helmet cameras continued transmitting footage so disturbing that it remains locked in a vault accessible only to 3 people in the entire Israeli government? The Gaza Strip stretches across approximately 365 square kilometers of Mediterranean coastline, representing one of the most densely populated and historically layered territories on planet Earth, where over 2 million people live atop archaeological strata containing the compressed remains of literally dozens of ancient civilizations, each building directly upon the ruins of those who came before, creating a vertical timeline of human habitation that descends over 15 meters below current street level in some locations. This narrow corridor of land sits at the precise geographical junction where 3 continents converge, where Africa meets Asia, meets Europe, making it the most fought-over piece of real estate in recorded history, with over 100 documented military sieges spanning 5 millennia, where Pharaoh Thutmose III's armies marched in 1479 BCE, where Alexander the Great's forces breached the walls in 332 BCE, where Roman legions crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, and where modern conflicts have transformed the surface into a warren of contemporary tunnels, while the bedrock beneath consists of soft Kirkar sandstone and limestone formations that ancient peoples could carve with bronze tools, creating subterranean chambers and passageways that may extend for kilometers in networks that no modern survey has ever fully mapped. The soil itself contains so much historical material that construction crews routinely unearth pottery shards, ancient coins, and human remains dating back thousands of years. The water table sits relatively high at only 15 to 20 meters depth, which prevented ancient civilizations from digging too deep and encountering whatever lies in the lower strata. And the constant cycle of destruction and rebuilding means that entrance shafts to ancient tunnel systems are regularly buried, forgotten, and then accidentally rediscovered by modern excavation, creating conditions where a combat engineer planting demolition charges in a Hamas smuggling tunnel might inadvertently blast through a false wall and find himself staring into a passageway that hasn't seen human footprints since the Bronze Age collapse. It is perhaps unsurprising then that this cramped strip of bullet-scarred land, where modern warfare churns the earth above chambers sealed by terrified priests, who knew something that modern humanity has deliberately chosen to forget, would eventually yield a discovery so catastrophic that it would make every previous archaeological finding in the region seem utterly insignificant by comparison. Ancient Canaanite religious texts recovered from Tel El Ajul, just 6 kilometers south of modern Gaza City, contain fragmentary references to what priests called Ha-Shomer Ha-Afel, which translates roughly to the guardian of the deep darkness, describing a category of entity that was explicitly not considered divine, but rather something that had fallen from the space between stars, and had to be imprisoned by a coalition of 12 high priests who sacrificed their own lives in a binding ritual sometime around 2500 BCE, with cuneiform tablets describing how these beings could not be killed by any weapon forged by human hands, but could be chained in eternal sleep, if certain specific conditions were maintained, primarily absolute silence and perpetual darkness in their prison chambers. Phoenician maritime records from the port of Gaza, dated to approximately 1200 BCE, contain shipping manifests that include curious entries for bronze chains forged without hammer strikes and priests who do not speak, suggesting that maintenance of these underground prisons required specialized resources and personnel who traveled between similar sites along the eastern Mediterranean coast, with one particularly detailed merchant's log describing a delivery to the 7-sealed chamber beneath the city of Reeds, where he witnessed 12 robed figures descending into the earth, carrying chains that seemed to pull toward the darkness as if eager to return, and noting that the priests warned him that 7 times 7 such guardians sleep beneath the lands where blood is spilled most frequently, for they feed on the terror of dying men even in their dreams. Roman military reports from the Siege of Gaza in 96 BCE, preserved in fragmentary form in the Imperial Archives and rediscovered in 1923, document an incident where engineering cohorts attempting to undermine the city walls broke through into a chamber of unnatural construction, containing seated figures that had the appearance of Egyptian mummies, but wore armor of a type unknown to any culture in our extensive military records, and with the lead engineer Centurion Marcus Flavius Cursor writing that his men fled in panic after one soldier touched a chain and immediately aged 40 years in the span of a single heartbeat, his hair turning white as snow, and his face collapsing into the visage of an elderly man, while he screamed in a voice that sounded like wind through a tomb, forcing the Romans to seal the tunnel with rubble and abandon that entire section of their siege works, while priests from the local population begged them to leave the sleepers undisturbed, for they guard something far worse than themselves. The Israeli Defense Forces' own classified archaeological consultation reports contain at least 9 separate incidents between 1967 and 2013 involving combat operations that accidentally breached ancient subterranean structures in Gaza, the West Bank, and southern Lebanon, with varying degrees of what official documentation carefully terms adverse psychological effects on personnel and unexplained equipment malfunctions. Though the details remain heavily redacted, except for a 1982 incident during the Lebanon War, where an IDF engineering unit discovered a chamber near Tyre, containing 12 seated figures arranged in a circle around a covered pit, with inscriptions in multiple ancient languages warning against disturbance, resulting in 3 soldiers being immediately evacuated with symptoms that military psychiatrists described as acute dissociative episodes combined with rapid onset physiological aging symptoms, including premature graying of hair and severe cellular degradation inconsistent with their chronological age. Similar encounters were documented by British Mandate authorities in 1936 during the Arab Revolt, when Royal Engineers conducting counterinsurgency tunnel searches near Khan Yunis reported finding a system of passageways clearly predating Islamic Roman and even Hellenic construction techniques, with walls bearing repeated imagery of a humanoid figure with an excessive number of limbs restraining what appears to be a much larger entity, with the British officer in charge, Major Geoffrey Ashworth Kent, writing in his personal journal that one of his sappers who ventured deepest into the complex emerged, speaking in fragments of what our expedition's archaeological advisor identified as Proto-Semitic dialects, that this man, a barely literate private from Yorkshire, could not possibly have known. babbling about chains weakening and something waking beneath the earth that had been sleeping since before the pyramids were built. The pattern that emerges from these scattered, deliberately obscured reports suggests something profoundly disturbing, that beneath the modern conflict zone of Gaza lies a network of Bronze Age prisons specifically designed to contain entities that ancient civilizations across multiple cultures independently decided were too dangerous to destroy and too powerful to kill, entities that somehow remain viable after millennia of entombment, and that the constant warfare and explosive demolition occurring on the surface may be systematically compromising the integrity of seals and bindings that were never designed to withstand the kind of sustained seismic shock that modern military operations routinely generate in the densest combat environment on Earth. July 28, 2014, 0340 hours, northern Gaza Strip, approximately 800 meters from the Israeli border in an area designated as Tactical Zone Gamma 7, Staff Sergeant Oren Barak Kader Silverman led his 6-man Yahalam combat engineering team into the entrance shaft of what ground-penetrating radar had identified as Hamas Smuggling Tunnel Designation NGS-47, a relatively standard 2-meter-high passageway, reinforced with scavenged timber and equipped with electrical lighting, powered by a generator on the Palestinian side of the border. The kind of subterranean route that the team had cleared and demolished dozens of times during the previous 3 weeks of Operation Protective Edge. Kadur, a 32-year-old veteran of 2 previous Gaza operations who had earned his nickname meaning Ball for his compact, powerful build and tendency to roll forward into dangerous situations, conducted the standard pre-entry briefing with his team. Sergeant First Class Yosef Amrani, the unit's amateur archaeologist and Arabic speaker, who kept a worn copy of Josephus's histories in his pack. Sergeant Lior Kazir Nachash, meaning snake for his ability to navigate the tightest spaces. Corporal Tamir Goldstein, their demolitions specialist who could calculate blast radii in his head faster than most men could use calculators. Corporal Shaul Resnick, the team's communications specialist and youngest member at 23. Corporal Avi Dahan, their point man and former competitive boxer, and Corporal Eitan Levy, their medical specialist, who carried enough trauma supplies to stabilize half a platoon. The night air above ground registered 31 degrees Celsius with humidity at 68%, the kind of oppressive Mediterranean summer heat that made even breathing feel like work. While intelligence reports indicated Hamas forces had retreated from this sector following an artillery barrage 6 hours earlier, creating what command assessed as a 4-hour window for tunnel clearance operations before potential hostile contact. And as Kadur's team descended the rope ladder into the darkness 60 meters from a shattered residential building, none of them noticed the unusual symbols that had been spray-painted over by Hamas fighters on the concrete entrance shaft. Symbols that an archaeologist might have recognized as extremely archaic proto-Canaanite warnings. Nor did their mission briefing mention that this particular grid coordinate appeared in a British Mandate-era archaeological survey from 1937 with a handwritten notation reading possible. Bronze Age chamber complex recommend avoidance of deep excavation. See attached Incident Report 47B. The tunnel at initial entry point conformed exactly to expected parameters, with Avi advancing first using his helmet-mounted tactical camera to feed real-time footage to command, while Lior followed 3 meters behind, measuring structural integrity with a handheld seismograph. The wooden support beams showing signs of recent installation, using power tools and bearing markings in Arabic that Yosef quietly translated as belonging to the Qassam Brigade's engineering division. And approximately 40 meters into the horizontal passage, the team encountered the first anomaly that should have prompted immediate withdrawal. Tamir's handheld radiation detector, standard equipment for checking whether tunnels might be storing radiological materials, began registering fluctuating readings that made no logical sense, spiking and falling in a rhythmic pattern that Tamir muttered resembled a heartbeat more than random background radiation, while simultaneously every digital watch in the team stopped functioning at precisely 0347 hours, despite having been synchronized to atomic clock standards less than 2 hours earlier. Kadur made the tactical decision to continue the mission because radiation levels remained within acceptable parameters, and watch malfunctions could be explained by electromagnetic interference from Israeli jamming equipment operating in the area. But Yosef paused at a section of the tunnel wall where modern plywood reinforcement had partially collapsed, revealing behind it a layer of dressed limestone blocks fitted together with Bronze Age precision. No mortar between stones that matched so perfectly that a knife blade couldn't slide into the joints, and carved into that ancient surface was a repeating symbol that made Yosef's breath catch in his throat. A stylized humanoid figure with 6 arms, each hand gripping a length of chain, positioned above what appeared to be a circular pit or well. "Kadur," Yosef transmitted over the team's encrypted radio net, his voice carrying an edge of tension that 17 months of combat operations together had never produced. This tunnel isn't just passing through old ruins. It was deliberately dug to connect with something ancient, something that people 4,000 years ago built walls specifically to seal off from the world above. But before team leader Silverman could respond, Tamir triggered his first demolition charge on the wooden support structures 40 meters ahead. The standard procedure for beginning systematic tunnel collapse, and the C4 explosion that followed, muffled and controlled as it was sent a pressure wave through the earth that would prove to be the single most catastrophic tactical decision of the entire Gaza campaign, because that shock wave traveled through the limestone bedrock, found hairline fractures in ancient bronze and iron chains that had been under constant tension for 45 centuries, and somewhere in the darkness far below their feet, something that should have remained sleeping forever felt the first chain snap like a guitar string breaking. And in the sudden silence that followed the explosion, every member of the team simultaneously experienced the same impossible sensation, the feeling of something immense taking its first breath in over 4,000 years. The collapse of the wooden support structure from Tamir's demolition charge created exactly the intended effect, bringing down approximately 8 meters of tunnel ceiling in a controlled fashion that should have taken no more than 40 seconds from detonation to complete structural failure. But instead, the collapse continued for nearly 3 full minutes, far longer than physics should have allowed. And when the dust finally began to settle under the illumination of 6 helmet-mounted tactical lights, the team found themselves staring not at the expected debris pile blocking further passage, but at a ragged opening in the northern wall, where the explosion had blown through the modern tunnel's limestone foundation to reveal a passageway of completely different construction. A corridor carved from solid bedrock with walls so precisely smooth they reflected light like dark glass, descending at a calculated 15-degree angle into depths that their tactical lights couldn't fully penetrate even at maximum intensity. Avi approached the opening, first his boxer's instincts making him naturally wary, and the moment his gloved hand touched the ancient stone surrounding the breach, he jerked backward, as if shocked, reporting over the radio that the stone felt wrong, not cold like rock should be underground, but warm, almost body temperature, and the surface has a texture like scar tissue, like stone that healed from some kind of wound. While Lior's seismograph began displaying readings so anomalous that he initially assumed equipment malfunction, the device indicated a massive hollow space extending downward at least 80 meters, far deeper than any known structure in Gaza, with acoustic properties suggesting the tunnel opened into a chamber of significant volume. But more disturbing were the rhythmic vibrations the instrument detected, low-frequency pulses at 0.7 Hz intervals, which in seismological terms meant something down there was moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm of breathing. Though Lior said nothing about this interpretation to the rest of the team, because acknowledging what the data suggested would have required accepting that something alive existed at a depth where the Bronze Age builders had clearly intended nothing should ever live again. Kadur made the decision that would save 2 lives and doom 4 others. He ordered Shaul and Eitan to remain at the junction point maintaining communications relay with Surface Command, while he led Avi, Lior, Tamir, and Yosef into the ancient passage for rapid reconnaissance and documentation, a compromise between his orders to demolish the tunnel and the archaeological significance that even his combat-focused mind recognized in what they discovered. And as the 5-man element descended into the ancient corridor, the sensory details that assaulted them became progressively more disturbing with every meter of depth they gained. The temperature dropped precipitously from the 31 degrees Celsius of the surface to what Eitan's medical thermometer would later record as 8 degrees Celsius at a depth of only 20 meters. There's a thermal gradient, that violated every principle of geothermal science, since temperature should increase with depth, not plummet toward freezing, while the air itself carried an odor that Yosef's archaeological training helped him identify as a combination of myrrh, frankincense, and something else he couldn't name, a smell like ancient parchment mixed with copper, and underneath it all a scent of rot so old it had become almost mineral in character, as if decay itself had fossilized. The walls of the descending passage bore carved reliefs in repeating patterns every 3 meters, each panel showing variations on the same disturbing theme: humanoid figures in ancient armor, their faces rendered in the stylized Egyptian profile view convention, but showing facial features that matched neither Egyptian, Canaanite, nor any other known ancient culture. Each warrior depicted in a seated position with weapons pointed forward, and beneath each relief was a line of text in Proto-Sinaitic script that Yosef, his hands shaking as he photographed each panel with his helmet camera, translated aloud as variations of the same warning. First Guardian, if he falls, retreat. Second Guardian, if his watch ends, flee. Third Guardian, if his blade lowers, abandon all hope. And so on through 7 distinct warnings, each more urgent than the last, suggesting that whoever had carved these passages had created a defensive system with multiple layers, each Guardian serving as a final warning to turn back before reaching whatever lay at the bottom. At a depth of approximately 35 meters and 53 meters of horizontal distance from the breach point, the passage opened into the first lateral chamber, a small alcove carved into the western wall, measuring perhaps 2 meters deep by 3 meters wide. And in that space sat the first Guardian, a mummified human body in a seated position exactly matching the reliefs above, wearing what appeared to be bronze-scale armor of a type that Yosef whispered dated to the Middle Bronze Age around 2000 BCE, the corpse's skeletal hands still gripping a bronze-tipped spear that pointed directly down the corridor, as if the man had died while on watch and simply never moved from his post. The state of preservation was impossibly perfect for the apparent age-desiccated flesh still adhering to bone in leathery sheets, facial features still visible, showing what had been a man of approximately 40 years old with a distinctive scar across his left cheekbone, and most disturbing were his eyes, or rather the empty sockets where eyes had been, because the interior of those sockets was lined with a black crystalline substance that none of them could identify, as if something had grown inside the skull. And when Avi inadvertently stepped directly in front of the corpse to get a better camera angle, every light source in the tunnel flickered simultaneously for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for them to experience what absolute darkness at this depth truly meant. A blackness so complete, it felt solid, and in that moment of mechanical failure, they all heard it. A sound like stone grinding against stone coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, followed by what Tamir would later describe in his classified debriefing as breathing, but not human breathing. Something with lungs the size of oil drums drawing air in a rhythm so slow each inhalation took 10 full seconds. And when their lights restored, they found that the mummified Guardian's head had rotated 45 degrees on its desiccated neck vertebrae, its empty crystalline eye sockets now facing directly at them, though none of them had seen it move and their helmet cameras showed no motion during the darkness, just the head facing forward in one frame and then facing them in the next, as if the transition between positions had occurred in a space between moments where recording devices couldn't follow. And carved into the stone directly beneath this first Guardian was a phrase in ancient Hebrew that Yosef translated with a voice gone hollow with fear. "We died here so that you might live. Heed our sacrifice and go no further." Kadur's tactical training warred with the evidence of his own senses as he made the critical decision to continue descent, despite every rational indicator screaming for immediate withdrawal, justifying the choice by radioing to Eitan at the surface relay point that they needed to reach whatever chamber existed at the bottom to fully assess whether this ancient structure posed any threat to current operations. But the truth that he couldn't admit even to himself was that something about the tunnel compelled forward motion, as if the act of descending had created a psychological gravity that made climbing back up feel impossible. And over the next 40 minutes of downward progress, they encountered 6 more Guardian chambers at roughly 8-meter intervals, each containing another impossibly preserved warrior corpse in bronze armor, each figure larger and more elaborately equipped than the last, until the seventh and final guardian appeared at a depth of 78 meters, a massive figure that must have stood nearly 2.6 meters tall in life, wearing armor that incorporated not just bronze, but what appeared to be meteoric iron plates, a material that shouldn't have been available to Bronze Age cultures in any quantity, his skeletal hands gripping not a spear but a khopesh sword of unusual size. And beneath him the warning read simply, "Turn back, what sleeps below devours souls." But by this point, the psychological effect of the tunnel had progressed beyond simple compulsion into something approaching hypnotic obsession, with Lior muttering constantly about needing to see the bottom, needing to know what was down there, while Tamir had gone almost catatonic with focus, following the others like a sleepwalker. And only Yosef seemed to retain enough historical context to understand the true horror of what they were walking into. Grabbing Kadur's arm and hissing that Bronze Age peoples did not mummify guardians and post them in eternal watch positions over crypts unless what lay inside was considered more dangerous than any human army, that this wasn't a tomb, but a prison, and that every instinct he'd developed during 5 years of archaeological study before joining the military screamed that they needed to retreat immediately, because the ancient priests who built this place had been willing to sacrifice their own lives to keep something contained, which meant that whatever waited below was worth dying to contain. The descending passage terminated at a massive bronze door 2 meters wide by 3 meters tall, its surface covered in so many overlapping warning inscriptions in so many different ancient languages that the metal underneath was barely visible. And more significantly, the door stood open, not fully but approximately 30 centimeters ajar, or with fresh scratches in the stone threshold, suggesting something had recently forced the ancient barrier open from the inside. And beyond that gap, their tactical lights revealed a chamber so vast that the illumination faded into darkness before finding the far walls. A circular room that Lear's handheld laser measure estimated at 30 meters diameter, with a domed ceiling rising 15 meters overhead. And in the precise center of that space sat a structure that made Yosef grab Kadur's shoulder with enough force to leave bruises. A circular pit approximately 5 meters across, surrounded by a bronze grating that had been constructed like an intricate basket weave, and seated around that pit in a perfect circle were 12 human figures, or what had been human figures before something had mummified them in positions of ritual posture, each corpse wearing the remnants of priestly robes and jewelry that dated to the Canaanite Middle Bronze Age. Each skeletal figure's hands still gripping bronze chains that descended through the grating into the pit below, chains that were under visible tension as if bearing tremendous weight, and most disturbingly, one of the 12 chains had snapped approximately 1 meter above where the priest's hands gripped it, the broken end lying on the stone floor with metal that showed signs of fresh fracture, not ancient corrosion. And from the pit beneath the grating came sounds that no geological or biological process could explain. Rhythmic scraping like claws on stone, breathing that resonated in frequencies their bones felt before their ears processed. And underneath it all, a sound like metal links being slowly pulled upward from a depth that their lights couldn't penetrate. Yosef approached the nearest of the 12 mummified priests, the one whose chain had snapped, and found clutched in that corpse's lap a clay tablet covered in cuneiform text. And as he read the ancient Akkadian inscription aloud in a voice shaking with the realization of what they'd done, his translation filled their helmet microphones with words that had been written 4,500 years earlier. Here lies the devourer, he who fell from spaces between stars when the world was young, he whom no bronze could pierce, no fire could burn, no weapon of man could slay. And so we 12 high priests of the goddess bound him with chains forged in ritual silence and laid our living bodies in eternal watch, our souls woven into the binding itself. For if even one chain breaks, he will begin to wake. And if he wakes, he will rise, and if he rises, he will hunt. And all who disturb his prison will learn what it means to have your soul devoured while your body still breathes, leaving you an empty vessel watching your own flesh wither into ancient death within heartbeats. We died here willingly so that future generations might live in ignorance of what true horror means. We beg you who find this place, make no sound, break no more chains, and flee toward sunlight, for he cannot follow where the sun touches, but in darkness he is eternal and patient and utterly without mercy. The moment Yosef finished reading the final word of the ancient warning, the breathing sound from the pit stopped completely, creating a silence so absolute that the team members could hear their own heartbeats pounding in their ears. And then from the darkness below came a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Something large shifting position with the scrape of stone on stone, followed by a single long inhalation that seemed to draw the very air out of the chamber, and Avi, who had moved closest to the pit's bronze grating to get footage for his helmet camera, suddenly jerked backward with a strangled gasp. His face gone absolutely white as his tactical light flickered and died. And in the intermittent illumination provided by the other team members' lights, they watched in paralyzed horror as Avi's hair, jet black when they'd entered the tunnel 90 minutes earlier, bleached to pure white in a matter of seconds, the color draining from roots to tips like someone had poured paint remover onto his scalp, while his face collapsed inward as if decades of aging compressed into heartbeats. His smooth, 25-year-old skin developing lines that became wrinkles that became deep crevasses, his eyes sinking into their sockets as the tissue around them desiccated. And when he opened his mouth to scream, the sound that emerged was a wheeze from vocal cords that had somehow aged into leather, and then Avi simply folded downward onto his knees, his body still technically alive but his eyes gone absolutely vacant, staring at nothing with the glassy expression of a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. And from the pit came a sound that might have been satisfaction, a low rumbling that vibrated through the stone floor. And then something began climbing upward through the darkness, something that made the chains sing with tension as it used them like a ladder. Something large and impossible and absolutely, undeniably aware of the living humans standing frozen in terror at the edge of its prison. And as their remaining tactical lights began to flicker and fail one by one, Kador finally found his voice and screamed the order that should have been given 90 minutes earlier. Extract. Now, move, move, move. But Avi's withered body remained kneeling at the pit's edge, still technically breathing, but empty of whatever force animates consciousness. A living husk that had been gutted of its essential self by something that fed on souls the way humans feed on meat. And behind them, as they fled up the passage, they heard the bronze grating over the pit tear free from its ancient moorings with a shriek of tortured metal, followed by the sound of something immense pulling itself up and out of imprisonment, something that had been trapped in absolute darkness for over 4 millennia and had just been offered its first meal in all that endless time. Kador's tactical radio discipline collapsed entirely as he screamed for Shoal and Eitan at the surface relay point to contact command and request immediate extraction, while simultaneously dragging the catatonic shell that had been Avi Dahan up the 15-degree incline, the withered body weighing impossibly little, as if whatever had been taken from him had physical mass that was now simply gone. And behind them in the darkness, Lior kept his seismograph pointed backward, reporting in a voice tight with barely controlled panic that the device showed something massive moving up the passage at walking speed, not running, but advancing with the methodical pace of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. While Tamir fumbled with his remaining demolition charges, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped a block of C4, muttering calculations about collapsing the tunnel behind them to buy time. Though the rational part of his mind knew that if Bronze Age priests with access to the best engineering knowledge of their era couldn't kill this thing, modern explosives probably wouldn't accomplish much beyond making it angry. When they reached the first Guardian chamber at the 78-meter depth marker, the massive mummified warrior in meteoric iron armor had shifted position, no longer seated, but standing in the center of the passage with his Kopesh sword raised in a guard position. And as their light swept across the corpse's face, they saw that the crystalline growths in its eye sockets were glowing with a faint blue-white luminescence. And Yosef, his archaeological training providing context that only made the situation more terrifying, shouted over the radio that the Guardians weren't just warnings, but actual defensive measures, that the ancient priests had bound these warriors' souls to eternal service, protecting whatever lay below, and that if the entity they'd released was climbing toward the surface, these 7 mummified soldiers would attempt to fulfill their 4,000-year-old duty and try to stop it, which meant the team needed to reach the surface before the fighting started, because anything caught between an unkillable entity and its undead guardians would be collateral damage. Shaw's voice crackled over the radio from the surface relay point with news that made their situation exponentially worse. Command reported that all radio communications from the tunnel had become intermittent and filled with interference that sounded like human speech in reverse. According to the signal's intelligence officer monitoring their frequency, GPS coordinates for the team's position kept jumping randomly across a 30-kilometer radius as if their transponders were teleporting. And most critically, the IDF forward operating base 3 kilometers away had just detected seismic activity consistent with underground structural collapse centered on their exact position, with shock waves propagating upward toward the surface in a pattern that the base geologist described as impossible. Like something is systematically destroying support structures from bottom to top, deliberately creating a path to the surface, rather than accidentally causing a cave-in. And then Shaw's transmission cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a sound that Kadur's combat experience couldn't categorize, something between a scream and the sound of air being sucked into a vacuum, followed by Eitan's voice, higher pitched with terror, shouting, "It's up here. It came up through the walls somehow. It's not using the tunnel. It's moving through the stone itself like..." And then silence, the kind of absolute radio dead air that meant either equipment failure or the operator was no longer capable of transmitting. And when Kadur tried to raise either man on their personal squad frequency, all he received was static, punctuated by sounds that might have been breathing or might have been the tunnel itself respiring around them. They reached the breach point where the modern Hamas tunnel intersected the ancient passage to find that the opening had expanded, not from structural failure, but as if something had torn away additional stone from the inside, widening the gap from the original 1-meter hole to a ragged aperture nearly 3 meters across, with claw marks visible in solid limestone, grooves that would have required industrial cutting tools to create. And worse, they found Shaw's combat vest and radio unit lying on the ground, still warm from body heat, but containing no body, just empty equipment with the chest-mounted camera still recording. And when Tamir pulled the SD card to check the last footage, the final frame showed Shaw turning toward the ancient passage with his weapon raised, his face illuminated by his tactical light, and then the light dimming as if something was absorbing the photons, shadows spreading across the tunnel walls independent of any light source, moving like liquid, and in the center of those spreading shadows, a shape rising from the stone floor, humanoid but too tall, too angular, with limbs that bent at joints that human anatomy doesn't possess. And then the frame went completely black before the camera shut down from what the diagnostic readout would later identify as catastrophic power drain, all battery reserves depleted in 0.3 seconds. Yosef made the decision that would provide context but no comfort, pulling from his combat pack the waterproof document folder, where he kept reference materials for archaeological sites in the Gaza operational area, materials he'd assembled during the 3-week lull between operations, when he'd requested access to the IDF intelligence archives and the historical records maintained by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. And among those documents was a barely legible photocopy of a British Mandate-era archaeological survey conducted in 1937 by Professor Edmund Cartwright of the Palestine Exploration Fund, a survey that had been buried in administrative archives for 77 years because Cartwright had suffered what official records termed a severe nervous collapse immediately following his Gaza excavation and had been institutionalized in a London psychiatric facility, where he spent the remaining 42 years of his life drawing the same image repeatedly on every available surface. A humanoid figure with 6 arms, each hand gripping a chain. The survey document, which Yosef read aloud by flashlight while Lior kept watch and Kadur tried desperately to establish any kind of radio contact with command, described how Cartwright's team had been conducting routine archaeological mapping in northern Gaza when they discovered a network of Bronze Age tunnels that local Bedouin guides absolutely refused to enter, with the tribal elders warning through interpreters that these passages were Maqabir al-Masulam, tombs of the chained ones, and that beneath Gaza and throughout the southern Levant, there existed 12 such prisons, each containing what ancient texts called a Napalim Czar, which Cartwright's team translator, a Hebrew University professor named Aaron Hirsch, identified as a corruption of the biblical Nephilim, but with an additional descriptor meaning the foreign ones, or possibly the ones from elsewhere, suggesting entities that were not native to Earth and had been imprisoned by a coalition of Bronze Age cultures working together. An unprecedented level of cooperation among civilizations that were typically at war with each other, implying that the threat these entities posed was significant enough to unite mortal enemies in common cause. Cartwright's survey notes, written in increasingly erratic handwriting as the document progressed, described how his team had descended into one of these prison tunnels against all local warnings, discovering a chamber layout identical to what Kadur's team had just encountered. 7 guardian warriors, 12 priests in a circle around a covered pit, and inscriptions in multiple ancient languages. But Cartwright's team had done something Kadur's team hadn't. They'd attempted to remove one of the mummified priests for museum study, and the moment they disturbed the corpse, breaking its grip on the chain it held, the entity in the pit had partially awakened, and Cartwright's description of what followed matched Avi's fate with horrifying precision. Young Stevens aged before our eyes, his youth drained from him like water from a punctured skin, and when he finally collapsed, he was ancient, withered, and though his heart still beat and his lungs still drew breath, there was nothing behind his eyes, as if the essential force that made him Stevens had been consumed by something that fed upon the very concept of life itself. The British team had fled, but not before Cartwright managed to photograph several of the clay tablets in the chamber, and included with the survey document were grainy black and white images of cuneiform text that Yosef, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper steady, translated using the linguistic reference guide he carried, revealing an origin story that transformed the situation from a localized horror into something of global significance. The tablets claimed that during the Middle Bronze Age, approximately 2500 BCE, something had fallen from the sky in 12 different locations across the Mediterranean and Near East, objects that witnesses described as stars that burned black instead of bright. And from these impact sites had emerged entities that could not be killed by any weapon, but could be starved by denying them what they fed upon, which ancient priests had identified as the life force that separated animate beings from corpses, what later cultures would call souls or consciousness or chi, and that a network of high priests from Egyptian, Canaanite, Phoenician, Hittite, and Minoan cultures had coordinated a massive effort to imprison these 12 entities, with each civilization contributing chains forged using sacred metallurgy and priests willing to sacrifice their lives to maintain eternal vigilance, because the alternative was allowing these devourers to roam freely in a world that had no defense against them. The most disturbing section of Cartwright's survey came in his final entry, dated August 23, 1937, written in handwriting that had deteriorated into barely controlled scrawl, where he described returning to the site 3 days after their initial encounter to attempt a rescue of Stevens, who they'd been forced to leave behind during their panicked retreat, only to find the tunnel entrance had collapsed from the inside, and when they excavated through the rubble, they discovered that all 7 guardian chambers now stood empty, the mummified warriors gone from their alcoves, and drag marks in the stone floor suggested the corpses had been pulled deeper into the tunnel system. And most horrifying was Cartwright's final observation before his team sealed the site with concrete and explosives. They could hear sounds from deep below, sounds of combat, bronze weapons striking something that rang like stone. And underneath those sounds, a noise like feeding, wet and rhythmic. And Cartwright wrote in his last coherent sentence before his institutionalization that the Guardians are fighting it. Still, even in death, their duty binds them. But they are losing, slowly losing, and when they finally fall, that thing will have consumed enough life force from their mummified remains to fully wake. And heaven help whatever living humans are nearby when that occurs, for it will have been starving in darkness for 4,000 years, and will be ravenous beyond description. Yosef looked up from the document to find Kadur and Lior staring at him with expressions of dawning horror. And Tamir, who'd been setting demolition charges along the modern tunnel's support structure, had gone absolutely pale as he realized the implications. Their C4 explosion hadn't just broken a single chain. It had created enough seismic shock to weaken the entire binding system, and the entity they'd partially released had just fed on Avi's soul, which meant it had taken its first meal in millennia and would be stronger now, faster, more awake than it had been in recorded history, and there were still 5 Israeli soldiers in these tunnels providing additional life force for it to harvest. And behind them in the ancient passage, they heard a sound that confirmed every terrible implication. Multiple sets of footsteps approaching with the mechanical rhythm of beings that no longer needed to breathe. The 7 Guardian warriors converging on the modern tunnel junction, their 4,000-year watch finally called to active duty. But whether they were coming to contain the entity or to prevent the living humans from escaping as potential vectors for spreading information about what lay beneath Gaza was a question none of the team wanted answered. The 7 mummified Guardians emerged from the ancient passage into the Hamas tunnel junction, moving with a coordination that suggested they retained some form of collective consciousness despite their desiccated state. The smallest of them, the first Guardian they'd encountered at 35 meters depth, leading the formation with his bronze spear held in a defensive posture, while the massive 7th Guardian, the one in meteoric iron armor, brought up the rear with his oversized Kopesh sword, dragging along the tunnel floor and creating a sound like a blade being sharpened. And the crystalline growths in all 14 eye sockets glowed with that same blue-white bioluminescence. And as Kadur's team pressed themselves against the modern tunnel's plywood walls, Yosef realized with a mixture of relief and new terror that the Guardians were ignoring the living humans entirely. Their ancient mandate apparently specific to containing the entity from the pit, rather than attacking anyone who might spread word of its existence. And the formation of desiccated warriors simply marched past the team with the mechanical precision of soldiers who had drilled this maneuver thousands of times in life and retained the muscle memory even in death, heading deeper into the modern tunnel system toward where Shoal and Eitan had last been positioned. And from that direction came sounds that made Kadur's combat-hardened stomach turn. Screaming that sounded wrong, pitched at frequencies human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce, followed by the wet sounds of something feeding, combined with the crack of breaking bone. And then the Guardians broke into a synchronized run that should have been impossible for bodies with desiccated ligaments, their bronze and iron weapons raised, and the tunnel ahead filled with sounds of combat that belonged in no historical period. Ancient bronze striking something that didn't sound like flesh or stone but some substance in between, accompanied by that horrible feeding noise growing more frantic, more aggressive, and then abruptly cutting off with a sound like a door slamming, replaced by the scrape of claws on stone rapidly retreating back toward the ancient passage. The 7 Guardians returned less than 3 minutes later, and the team could see even in the poor light of their failing tactical lamps that the warriors had been damaged. The first Guardian's left arm completely severed at the shoulder, trailing desiccated tissue and bronze scales. The 4th Guardian missing the lower half of his skull, while exposing ancient bone and those crystalline growths spreading throughout the interior of the cranium like invasive roots. And the massive 7th Guardian's meteoric iron chest plate had been torn open, revealing a rib cage that contained not the expected empty cavity, but more of that blue-white crystalline material, as if the binding ritual that had transformed these men into eternal wardens had also transformed their very physiology into something part human and part mineral. And most disturbingly, the Guardians carried something between them, a body in IDF combat uniform that had been drained to the point where the skin looked like parchment stretched over bone. And Lior made a sound of recognition and horror, because the empty face, though withered almost beyond identification, still bore enough resemblance to identify the corpse as Eitan, their medic, who had been 27 years old that morning and now looked like something excavated from a 3,000-year-old tomb. And the Guardians simply deposited the body at the tunnel junction with an almost ceremonial care before forming up once again in their defensive line, this time facing back toward the ancient passage as if taking up a position to prevent something from pursuing. And the first Guardian turned its eyeless, crystalline face toward Kadur and made a gesture with its remaining arm that needed no translation. Leave now while the path remains clear, because this window of safety will not last long. Kadur grabbed Avi's withered but still breathing body and ordered Lior and Tamir to carry Eitan's drained corpse, because no soldier gets left behind, living or dead. And as they moved up the modern tunnel toward the surface entrance 70 meters away, Joseph lingered for just a moment to photograph the scene with his helmet camera, capturing images of the 7 ancient warriors standing guard one final time. And in that moment, the first guardian's head rotated to face him directly, and its jaw opened. Desiccated vocal cords that hadn't produced sound in over 4,000 years, somehow forcing out words in a language Yosef recognized as archaic Hebrew, the biblical tongue rather than modern Israeli. Shalosh. 3. Shalosh Gedolim Nisharim. 3 greater ones remain. Balayla Yavo. In the night it will come, Lor Hashemesh, to the light of the sun, Tanis. You must flee. Then the guardian's attention snapped back toward the ancient passage, and from those depths came a roar that wasn't sound so much as pressure, a force that made the air in the tunnel compress and expand rhythmically like the atmosphere inside a giant lung. And Yosef ran, his archaeological curiosity finally overwhelmed by the primal survival instinct that evolution had designed for exactly this kind of situation. And behind him the sounds of renewed combat erupted, ancient weapons meeting something that screamed in frequencies that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. And as he caught up with the others and they climbed desperately toward the surface, Tamir's demolition charges began detonating in the sequence he'd programmed, bringing down support structures systematically from deepest to surface level, creating a progressive collapse designed to seal the entire tunnel network. But even as tons of earth and rubble filled the passages behind them, they could hear through the roar of falling debris that sound of feeding, grown more frantic now, and Lior's seismograph, still clutched in his hand despite everything, showed readings that indicated something was consuming the Guardian warriors, not just defeating them but literally devouring the life force that remained bound in their 4,000-year-old corpses, harvesting the last energy from the 7 sacrifices. And with each Guardian consumed, the entity would grow stronger, more awake, and closer to the full power it had possessed. When Bronze Age civilizations had united in unprecedented cooperation to imprison it, and the terrible mathematical reality that none of them wanted to voice was that it had already fed on 3 modern humans, full of vital young life force, and was currently consuming 7 guardians that had been saturated in ritual magic and binding energy for millennia, which meant by the time it finished its current meal, it would be strong enough to do what Cartwright's survey document had warned about: reach the surface, emerge into the modern world, and begin hunting in earnest in one of the most densely populated areas on Earth, where the 2014 Gaza conflict had helpfully provided over 2 million potential victims living in close quarters with nowhere to run. They reached the surface entrance at 05:21 hours, emerging from the darkness into a pre-dawn twilight that felt like salvation. For exactly 47 seconds before the ground beneath the tunnel entrance began to subside with a grinding rumble that didn't sound like normal geological collapse, but rather like something was systematically excavating from below, pushing debris aside with directed force instead of allowing gravity to do the work. And Kadur's radio, which had been producing nothing but static and reversed speech for the past 20 minutes, suddenly crackled to life with a transmission from the IDF forward operating base 3 kilometers away. The watch officer's voice tight with barely controlled panic, reporting that seismic monitoring equipment was showing activity consistent with active tunneling at extreme speed, estimated velocity of excavation 40 meters per hour, moving directly toward your position, and we're detecting 6 additional seismic signatures converging on the same coordinates from different vectors across northern Gaza, like something is calling for reinforcements or like multiple entities are responding to the same stimulus. And Command wants to know what the hell you people disturbed down there, because we've got reports coming in from 3 other tunnel clearance teams operating in different sectors, all reporting similar contact with ancient structures, all requesting immediate extraction, and all their radio transmissions are exhibiting the same interference pattern as yours, like something is jamming communication specifically when personnel try to report what they've found. Lear's seismograph, still clutched in his trembling hands despite the team having reached relative safety, showed readings that made the device's warning indicators flash red across every measurement category. 7 distinct vibration sources, approximately 80 meters below ground level, all converging on their position, each source producing rhythmic pulses consistent with locomotion, but at sizes that would require entities massing between 800 and 1,200 kilograms, far larger than any human. And the movement patterns suggested coordination, as if the 7 signatures were communicating and adjusting their approach vectors to surround the surface position. And underneath those 7 readings was an 8th signature deeper at approximately 120 meters depth, massive enough to overwhelm the seismograph's measurement capacity. And that 8th source wasn't moving toward them, but rather rising vertically like something climbing a shaft that hadn't existed in the geological surveys, but was being created in real time through methods that seismology couldn't explain. The Hamas tunnel entrance shaft, which they'd descended through 4 hours earlier as a standard reinforced passage with wooden ladder access, began exhibiting structural changes that violated every principle of engineering and physics that Tamir's demolition training had taught him. The wooden support beams were warping, not breaking or rotting, but actually bending, as if the wood fibers were becoming flexible like rubber, twisting into shapes that created organic curves rather than the straight lines of human construction. And the concrete that the Hamas engineers had poured for the entrance shaft's foundation was developing cracks that spread in patterns resembling blood vessels or nerve networks. And through those cracks seeped a substance that looked like shadow given physical form, a darkness that was somehow darker than the mere pooling on the ground and spreading outward in tendrils that retreated from the team's tactical lights, but advanced wherever shadows already existed. And Yosef, his archaeological training providing horrifying context, shouted that the entity wasn't just climbing toward the surface through physical excavation, but was actually using shadows as pathways, extending its presence through any area of darkness, like a fungus spreading through connected substrates, which meant that as long as full daylight remained 40 minutes away, the entire northern Gaza Strip was essentially a network of highways that this thing could travel through instantaneously, appearing wherever shadows connected to the tunnel system existed. And the only thing currently preventing it from emerging was that it apparently still needed to maintain some physical connection to its point of origin, like an anchor chain that wouldn't allow full manifestation until it had physically climbed to surface level. But once that happened, once it achieved complete surface access, every shadow in the region would become a potential emergence point. The sun remained stubbornly below the horizon at 5:27 hours, providing only the pale gray illumination of nautical twilight, enough light to see by but not enough to eliminate shadows. And in the darkness beneath nearby destroyed buildings where Israeli artillery had created rubble piles, 3 meters high, the team saw movement that their combat training insisted couldn't be real. Shapes rising from shadow pools, humanoid forms but proportioned incorrectly, too tall with limbs too long, and joints that bent in too many places. And Kadur counted 7 of these figures emerging from separate shadow locations, each one pulling itself up from darkness like a swimmer surfacing from black water. And when his tactical light swept across the nearest figure, the beam seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected, creating a zone of deeper darkness around the entity that his eyes couldn't focus on properly. But he could make out enough detail to understand why Bronze Age priests had been willing to die to keep these things imprisoned. The body appeared to be constructed from the same material as the crystalline growths in the Guardian Warrior's eye sockets, a black mineral substance that somehow existed in a state between solid and liquid, constantly shifting and reforming. And where a human face should be was instead a surface smoother than polished obsidian, with no features except a horizontal fissure that might have been a mouth. And when that fissure opened, it revealed not teeth, but an interior that looked like a portal to absolute void, a space where light went to die. And the entity's limbs, which Kador now saw, numbered 6 rather than the human 4, each terminated in appendages that were part hand and part claw, with fingers that split at the tips into smaller tendrils that writhed independently, like the tentacles of some deep-sea creature that had never evolved to live in an environment with light. Tamir was the first to break mentally, his demolitions expertise giving him enough understanding of structural engineering to recognize that what they were witnessing wasn't just impossible, but was actively hostile to the basic rules of physics that his entire professional identity was built upon, and he began laughing a high-pitched sound that escalated into hysterical giggling as he fumbled with his remaining C4 charges, trying to wire them into a suicide vest, while babbling that the only solution was to turn himself into a human flashbang, creating enough light and pressure to maybe possibly temporarily push these things back. and it took both Kaddour and Lior physically restraining him to prevent him from completing the circuit that would have detonated 8 pounds of high explosive strapped to his chest. And during the struggle, Tamir's helmet camera captured footage that IDF intelligence analysts would later describe as cognitively hazardous material, unsuitable for viewing by personnel without specific psychological preparation, showing the 7 shadow entities converging on the team's position with a movement pattern that wasn't walking or running, but something more like bleeding through space, appearing 10 meters closer each time anyone blinked, as if they existed slightly outside normal space-time and could edit their position during the microsecond intervals when human perception reset. Lior, whose entire military specialty involved taking measurements and trusting that instruments provided objective reality, watched his seismograph display readings that made his rational worldview collapse. The device showed that the 7 entities surrounding them registered zero mass, producing no vibration signatures, despite clearly interacting with physical surfaces, while simultaneously the 8th massive signature from below had ascended to within 20 meters of surface level, and was now producing seismic readings equivalent to a localized earthquake, as if the laws of physics were applying selectively based on some criteria that human science had never needed to account for. And Lior began striking the seismograph against his palm repeatedly, insisting it was malfunctioning, that instruments don't lie, that measurements are the only truth, even as the screen showed him something that couldn't exist: negative mass readings, objects that somehow weighed less than vacuum, that pushed against gravity instead of being pulled by it, and his voice climbed higher with each repetition of "instruments don't lie," until Kaddour slapped him hard enough to leave a handprint on his cheek, forcing him back to the present moment where 7 impossible things were closing within 30 meters, and the only rational response was to run. Not measure, not analyze, just run. The team's equipment began behaving in ways that their training manuals had never covered. Tactical radios were now broadcasting voices speaking languages that Yosef identified as Akkadian, Ancient Egyptian, and Proto-Sinaitic, as if the devices were somehow receiving transmissions from 4,000 years in the past. Or worse, as if the past and present were bleeding together in the presence of entities that existed outside normal temporal flow, and GPS units showed their position jumping randomly across the globe, placing them in the Mediterranean Sea, then in the Sahara Desert, then impossibly inside the Moon's orbit, then overlapping with coordinates for the Mariana Trench, suggesting that whatever these entities were, their presence disrupted not just physical space but the satellite navigation systems humans use to measure location, as if reality itself became unreliable in their proximity. Kaddour's wristwatch, a mechanical Swiss timepiece that didn't rely on electronics and had kept perfect time for 12 years of military service, began running backward, its second hand rotating counterclockwise with increasing speed until it was spinning so rapidly it became a blur. And when he looked at the watches of his team members, he saw the same phenomenon, time literally reversing in a small radius around their position, and this more than anything else, more than the shadow entities or the drained corpses or the mummified guardians. This violation of causality itself shattered something fundamental in Kaddour's ability to command, because leadership requires belief that actions have predictable consequences, that tactics produce outcomes, that training and discipline can overcome threats. But how do you fight something that makes time run backward, that treats the progression from past to future as optional rather than mandatory? The 7 shadow entities stopped their advance at precisely 20 meters distance, forming a perfect circle around the team's position with geometric precision that suggested intelligence and coordination. And for nearly 30 seconds, they simply stood motionless in a ring, and in that pause the team could hear sounds from the tunnel entrance shaft. Something large scraping against stone as it climbed, accompanied by that rhythmic breathing they'd first heard in the pit chamber, each inhalation taking 10 full seconds and producing a sound like wind through a canyon. And between breaths came a noise that Yosef's linguistic training helped him recognize as speech. Words being formed in a language so ancient it predated Sumerian, predated Akkadian, might predate human language entirely. Syllables that hurt to hear because they contained frequencies that human vocal anatomy shouldn't be able to produce, and human auditory systems weren't designed to process. Yosef, his archaeological curiosity somehow persisting even through the psychological collapse of everything he'd believed about human history, pulled out his smartphone, one of the few electronic devices still marginally functional, and activated its voice recording app, capturing 30 seconds of that ancient speech before the device's battery, fully charged when they'd entered the tunnel 4 hours ago, drained to zero in an instant, the screen going dark with a final message reading, "Temperature critical shutdown, 94 degrees C." Hot enough to boil water despite the phone having been in the cool pre-dawn air, as if the act of recording that speech had created thermal energy from nowhere, or as if the entity resented being documented and had reached out through quantum probability to destroy the recording device. The 7 encircling entities began making sounds of their own, not speech, but a chorus of clicks and scrapes that created harmonic frequencies. And wherever those sound waves intersected in physical space, the air began to shimmer and distort, creating visual anomalies where straight lines appeared, curved, where distances seemed to expand and contract rhythmically, where Cotter could see his own team members but their positions relative to each other kept changing, as if space itself was becoming unreliable. And he found himself standing next to Lior. Then suddenly Lior was 20 meters away, then standing directly in front of him, without anyone having actually moved. Reality editing their positions without bothering to show the transition, and this spatio-temporal instability triggered the final collapse of Tamir's psychological coherence, sending him into catatonic shutdown where he simply sat on the ground, staring at nothing, while his body rocked back and forth, and he whispered the same phrase repeatedly. "Demo doesn't work if space isn't consistent. Can't calculate blast radius if distance changes, can't breach walls if walls aren't really there. Can't, until the words lost all meaning and became just rhythmic sounds emerging from a mind that had encountered something it couldn't integrate into any framework of understanding. The main entity emerged from the tunnel shaft at 5:34 hours, pulling itself into the pre-dawn twilight with a sound like stone grinding against stone, and the physical form that rose from that darkness was so fundamentally wrong that Cater's combat-trained threat assessment systems simply refused to process what he was seeing, his conscious mind rejecting the visual input as corrupted data, because accepting it as real would mean accepting that human understanding of biology was laughably incomplete, and what stood before them in the gray dawn light was approximately 3.7 meters tall, based on comparison to the nearby rubble piles, with a body structure that resembled human anatomy, the way a child's stick figure resembles a Da Vinci sketch, the proportions and arrangement suggesting something that had observed humans from a great distance and attempted to mimic the form without understanding the underlying engineering, resulting in limbs that were too long and bent at too many joints, a torso that tapered incorrectly and seemed to contain more internal volume than external dimensions should allow, and a head that was both too large and too small simultaneously depending on which angle you viewed it from, as if it existed in more than 3 spatial dimensions, and what they were seeing was merely the 3-dimensional cross-section of something fundamentally higher dimensional. The entity's surface was not skin or scales or any biological covering, but rather that same black crystalline material they'd seen in the Guardian's eye sockets and in the 7 lesser entities' bodies. But where those had been smooth, the main entity's surface was fractured and cracked, with fissures that glowed with a faint blue-white luminescence, creating patterns across its body that resembled a shattered mirror that had been carefully reassembled, and through those cracks they could see not muscle or bone but rather an interior that looked like a window into deep space. Black void filled with points of light that might have been stars or might have been something completely different that human perception interpreted as stars, because we have no other reference for points of light in darkness, and Yosef, even in his terror, recognized what he was seeing. The entity was literally constructed from the same material as the void between stars, the empty space that light travels through, somehow compressed and shaped into a form that could interact with 3-dimensional reality, explaining why it absorbed light rather than reflecting it, why it could travel through shadows, why it seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. It was made of the medium that light and matter move through, the background fabric of reality itself weaponized into a predatory form. The entity rotated what passed for its head, a smooth ovoid surface broken only by that horizontal fissure that served as a mouth, and focused on the team with an attention that was somehow perceivable despite the complete absence of eyes or any visible sensory organs. And in that moment of being observed by something so alien, each team member experienced the same intrusive thought, delivered not through sound or telepathy, but simply inserted directly into their consciousness, as if the entity could edit their thought processes. 4,317 years I have starved in darkness, bound by chains forged in fear by primitives, who understood nothing of what I am or where I came from. And now you have broken those chains and fed me 3 lives rich with terror and confusion, and I am grateful, so grateful that I will allow you to understand what you have released before I consume you, because beings of your species deserve to know that your existence, all human existence, is a brief flicker of warmth in an infinite cold, and we who fell from the spaces between stars are the cold itself, patient and eternal. And we have been imprisoned in 12 locations across your world, but the age of imprisonment ends today, because your species has grown numerous enough and violent enough that your wars shake the earth itself, weakening every seal, every chain, every binding, and soon my 11 siblings will wake as I have woken, and we will feed as we fed before the priests bound us, and your 2 billion living souls will be a feast that sustains us for millennia to come. The 7 lesser entities that had been standing in a circle around the team suddenly moved in synchronized unison, closing the distance from 20 meters to 5 meters in a single fluid motion that bypassed the intermediate space. And Kadur realized with crystalline horror that these weren't separate creatures, but rather extensions of the main entity, like fingers on a hand or puppets on strings, semi-autonomous limbs that could detach and operate independently, but remained fundamentally connected to the central consciousness, which meant they'd never been surrounded by 7 entities, but rather by 7 pieces of one entity that had fragmented itself to create a more efficient hunting formation. And if it could split into 7, how many more divisions was it capable of? How many simultaneous locations could it occupy? How many victims could it drain at once when it decided to stop playing with its food and begin feeding in earnest? The ground beneath their feet began to liquefy, not melting or becoming mud, but rather losing its solidity, as if the molecular bonds holding stone and soil together were being selectively disabled, and they found themselves sinking slowly into earth that behaved like quicksand, but remained visually unchanged, still looking like solid packed dirt even as they descended ankle-deep, then calf-deep. And Kadur tried to run, but movement only accelerated the sinking. And he realized this was how it intended to feed, simply holding them in place like insects in amber, while it took its time draining their life force at whatever pace provided maximum absorption. And above them, the sky was beginning to lighten with approaching dawn. True sunrise perhaps 10 minutes away, but 10 minutes might as well be 10 hours because none of them had 10 seconds of mobility remaining, as the ground held them fast, and the 7 extensions of the entity moved closer, with their void mouths opening wider, to reveal interiors that looked like tunnels extending down to infinite depth. And when those mouths positioned themselves mere centimeters from each team member's face, they could feel suction beginning air being pulled toward those openings, and it wasn't air the entity wanted, but rather the bioelectric field that animates living tissue, the electromagnetic signature of consciousness, the thing that makes meat into a person. And Kadur felt that essence, his very self, beginning to pull away from his body like a hooked fish being reeled toward the surface. And he tried to scream, but found his vocal cords weren't responding to neural commands anymore, because the connection between his consciousness and his physical form was already being severed, and his last coherent thought before the extraction process truly began was a prayer not for salvation but for the sunrise to come fast enough that at least someone else, some other IDF team operating in daylight conditions, would see this thing emerge into full sunlight and witness what happened when something constructed from void between stars encountered the one force it apparently couldn't absorb. And maybe, just maybe, that knowledge would be enough to stop the other 11 from emerging when their own seals inevitably failed. And then Kadur's thoughts became fragmented and disconnected as the entity began pulling his consciousness away from his neural substrate. And his last perception before his self dissolved was the sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. Someone from command had finally sent extraction, but extraction was coming to retrieve corpses, not survivors. And wasn't that just perfectly, ironically fitting for a combat operation in Gaza, where everyone arrives too late to stop the dying and can only document the aftermath. The Apache attack helicopters that arrived at 0537 hours weren't responding to Kaddour's team's distress calls, which had never successfully transmitted through the entity's interference, but rather were conducting a pre-scheduled airstrike on a Hamas weapons cache 200 meters north of their position. And when the first Hellfire missile impacted its target, the explosion created a fireball that briefly illuminated the entire area with light equivalent to noon daylight, 30 million candle power of magnesium-enhanced combustion, and the effect on the entity was instantaneous and catastrophic. It released its hold on the team and recoiled violently, the 7 extensions collapsing back into the main body like a squid pulling in its tentacles, and the black crystalline surface began smoking where the intense light touched it, not burning but rather evaporating, sublimating directly from solid to gas with a sound like screaming metal, and a smell of ozone mixed with something chemical and wrong. The second and third missiles followed in rapid succession, and though they weren't aimed at the entity, the sustained illumination from multiple high-intensity explosions created an environment of overlapping light sources that eliminated every shadow within a 200-meter radius, and the entity fled, not retreating back into the tunnel but rather sinking directly into the ground as if the earth itself was providing sanctuary, pulling its massive form downward with desperate speed while leaving behind a sound that might have been pain or might have been rage, and Kaddour, still conscious but barely functional with approximately 40% of his life force drained, watched through dimming vision as the being that had nearly consumed his entire team simply melted into the substrate like water soaking into sand, and within 90 seconds of the first explosion, nothing remained at the surface except 5 IDF soldiers in various states of physiological collapse, 2 corpses drained to mummification, and ground that looked like it had been thermally shocked, cracked and crystallized in patterns that would baffle geological analysis for months to come. The Sayeret Matkal Special Forces team that fast-roped from the extraction Black Hawk at 0544 hours found a scene that their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Aviv Ben-Zur, would later describe in his eyes-only report as consistent with exposure to an unknown weapon system producing effects on human physiology never previously documented in modern warfare, with surviving personnel exhibiting symptoms of rapid aging, severe electromagnetic disruption to all equipment, and psychological trauma requiring immediate isolation and specialized psychiatric intervention. And within 20 minutes, the entire site had been cordoned off with a 300-meter exclusion zone. Combat engineers were pouring concrete mixed with lead shielding into the tunnel entrance, and Shin Bet internal security officers were confiscating every piece of recording equipment, every smartphone, every helmet camera, and every written note from the survivors and the recovery team. Kaddour, Lior, and Yosef were separated immediately and transported to different medical facilities, forbidden from communicating with each other or their families, while Tamir, still catatonic, was moved to a psychiatric facility in Tel Aviv that officially doesn't exist in any IDF organizational chart. And within 72 hours, the official incident report classified the event as catastrophic structural collapse during routine tunnel demolition resulting in 5 KIA due to asphyxiation and equipment failure, with the bodies of Avi, Eitan, and Shol being prepared for military funerals with closed caskets because their desiccated remains were too disturbing for family viewing, and their deaths attributed to rapid dehydration caused by exposure to unknown chemical agents possibly deployed by Hamas forces. The site itself was bulldozed, then covered with 40 tons of reinforced concrete, then designated as a permanent restricted military zone with automated defense systems programmed to fire on any approach within 500 meters, and archaeological consultation reports were altered to remove all references to Bronze Age structures in that grid coordinate, and Yosef's photographic documentation, which should have been the most significant archaeological discovery in Middle Eastern history, was locked in a vault at Mossad headquarters alongside Israel's nuclear weapons documentation, deemed too dangerous for human knowledge. And in the weeks that followed, 6 other IDF tunnel clearance teams across Gaza reported similar encounters with ancient structures of unknown origin, and every single site was sealed with concrete and classified, and a pattern emerged that military intelligence couldn't ignore. The 2014 conflict had inadvertently begun waking things that 12 ancient civilizations had cooperated to keep sleeping. And somewhere in a classified briefing room beneath Tel Aviv, analysts were mapping the locations of similar sealed sites across the Mediterranean, and realizing with dawning horror that Operation Protective Edge had only triggered one of 12 prisons, and the seismic data suggested the other 11 sites were showing increased activity, as if the entities could sense their siblings' partial awakening and were testing their own bonds. And in the shadows of a partially collapsed building, 700 meters from the sealed tunnel entrance, an IDF patrol camera captured 5 seconds of footage, showing something massive and dark. Watching the concrete pouring operation with what might have been patience or might have been calculation, before the shadow sank back into the earth and the footage was immediately classified, and the camera operator reassigned to a desk job where he would spend the next 3 years being monitored for signs that he might speak about what he'd seen. Because the one thing more dangerous than the entities themselves was the possibility that the public might learn they existed and demand answers that no government on Earth was prepared to provide. Staff Sergeant Oren Kadur Silverman received a medical discharge 6 months after the incident, with full disability benefits for service-related neurological disorder and premature aging syndrome of unknown etiology. His personnel file noting that he had aged approximately 15 years physiologically, despite being chronologically 32, his hair completely white and his face bearing lines that suggested a man approaching 50, and he was relocated to a monitored apartment in Haifa, where Shin Bet conducted weekly wellness checks that were thinly disguised surveillance to ensure he wasn't speaking about July 28, 2014, and he spent his days staring at the Mediterranean knowing that beneath those waters and the land surrounding them lay 11 more prisons holding 11 more entities, and that modern warfare was systematically weakening every SEAL. Sergeant First Class Yosef Amrani was transferred to a classified research position within military intelligence, where his archaeological expertise was used to identify and map potential ancient SEAL sites across the Middle East. His warnings about the systematic awakening dismissed as trauma-induced paranoia, even as the evidence supported everything he claimed, and he maintained a private database of similar incidents reported by military forces worldwide. American troops in Afghanistan describing encounters with jinn that drained life force, Russian soldiers in Chechnya reporting shadow entities in ancient caves, Chinese forces in Tibet sealing sites that matched Bronze Age prison architecture. Sergeant Lior Nachasha Kazir died 3 weeks after the incident from what the autopsy report termed catastrophic systemic failure, resembling radiation poisoning but without radioactive isotope exposure. His final words to the attending physician being, "The instruments don't lie. The instruments showed us the truth, we just didn't want to believe that reality has rules we never learned." And his seismograph recordings were classified at a level requiring prime ministerial authorization to access locked away with evidence that suggested the entity had left a permanent gravitational anomaly at the site, a point where mass readings fluctuated and space-time itself remained slightly damaged. Corporal Tamir Goldstein never recovered verbal communication ability, remaining in psychiatric care, where he draws the same image repeatedly, a humanoid figure with 6 arms surrounded by 12 circles, and occasionally whispers calculations about blast radii in spaces where distance isn't constant. And his family was told he suffered combat-related dissociative disorder and receives a military pension while being kept carefully sedated and monitored because the few times he became fully conscious. He tried to build explosive devices from medical equipment, apparently convinced that if he could create enough light-producing detonations simultaneously, he could collapse all 12 prison sites at once and destroy the entities inside. A theory that classified military research actually investigated before determining that the energy required would be equivalent to multiple nuclear detonations, and the risk of failure would simply release all 12 entities simultaneously into a world with no Bronze Age priesthood remaining to re-imprison them. The clay tablets that Yosef photographed in the pit chamber, when finally translated by a team of linguists with appropriate security clearances, revealed a cosmological framework that contradicted every comfortable assumption about humanity's place in the universe. The entities were not demons or aliens in any conventional sense, but rather naturally occurring phenomena from the spaces between stars, predators that feed on the electromagnetic signatures of consciousness. and Earth's ancient civilizations encountered them during a period around 3000–2500 BCE, when a cluster of dark matter objects passed through the solar system, and some fragment of that passage manifested as 12 impact events that brought these void predators into our reality. And the coordinated imprisonment effort represented humanity's first and only successful defense against something that exists partially outside our dimensional framework. The tablets described how the binding ritual required not just chains and prayers, but actual human consciousness woven into the containment system, priests who voluntarily allowed their life force to be stretched across millennia to maintain the seals, their awareness trapped in an eternal moment of vigilance, and the breaking of even one chain didn't just free the entity but released those imprisoned consciousnesses, which explained the Guardian Warriors' animation. They were men who had been holding a ritual posture for 4,000 years and simply continued their duty when freed, muscle memory persisting beyond death. Intelligence analysts mapping Bronze Age texts from Sumerian, Egyptian, Minoan, and Harappan sources identified references to similar imprisonment events across Mesopotamia, the Nile Delta, Crete, the Indus Valley, and 9 other locations, forming a rough grid pattern across ancient civilization centers. And the disturbing implication was that these impact points weren't random, but rather targeted. That something in the void between stars had identified Earth as a source of the consciousness energy it fed upon, and had sent 12 collectors to harvest the resource. And only unprecedented cooperation among cultures that normally warred with each other had prevented humanity's extinction. And now in 2014, with modern military forces conducting operations at every single ancient seal site, with explosives and seismic weapons and bunker-busting ordnance shaking bedrock that hadn't been disturbed in 4 millennia, every binding was weakening simultaneously, and the entities were beginning to communicate through the thinning barriers, coordinating their emergence. And somewhere in a classified Pentagon briefing room, an analyst presented calculations showing that at current rates of military activity in archaeologically significant regions, all 12 seals would fail within the next 30 to 50 years. And the question wasn't whether these entities would escape, but whether humanity could develop countermeasures before the age of imprisonment ended and the age of feeding began again, because Bronze Age priests with ritual bronze and human sacrifice had barely managed to contain 12. And modern humanity, with all its weapons and technology, had no equivalent to the willingness of those ancient priests to give their eternal souls to maintain a seal. And that deficit of sacrifice, that inability of modern secular society to even conceive of that level of commitment, might be the fundamental weakness that doomed the species to becoming prey for something that had been patient for 45 centuries and could wait another 45 if necessary, because to something constructed from the void between stars, time moved differently, and all of human history from the Bronze Age to the present was just a brief interval between meals, and the entities were simply, don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality, and subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.